The autumn wind carried dried leaves across the parking lot of the Westbrook Music Academy. It was one of those gray October afternoons when the sky looked heavy and tired, like it couldn't decide whether to rain or just stay gloomy forever. Inside the building, the hallways smelled like polished wood and old sheet music. This place had history. You could feel it in the walls. On the second floor, in a corner studio with tall windows and a beautiful black grand piano, sat a woman named Helen Porter. She was 53 years old, and she had been teaching piano at this academy for longer than most of her students had been alive, 22 years, to be exact. 22 years of sitting in this same room, listening to the same scales, correcting the same mistakes, and watching young fingers stumble over the same difficult passages. Helen was good at her job. Everyone said so. She had trained students who went on to win competitions, earn scholarships, and perform in concert halls across the country. Her waiting list was always full. Parents begged to get their children into her class. She had earned her reputation, and she wore it like armor. But somewhere along the way, something had changed inside her. Maybe it was the years of repetition. Maybe it was seeing so many students come and go, each one blending into the next. Or maybe she had just grown tired. Whatever the reason, Helen had become the kind of teacher who made judgments quickly. She looked at a student and decided within minutes whether they were worth her time or not. She didn't think of herself as cruel. She just believed she could see things others couldn't. She thought she had a gift for spotting talent. And in her mind, talent came from certain places. It came from families who valued music, from homes with pianos in the living room, from children who had been taking lessons since they could walk. Talent had a look, a background, a story that made sense. That afternoon, Helen was finishing up some paperwork when there was a soft knock on her door. She glanced at the clock. Her next student wasn't scheduled for another 30 minutes. She sighed and called out for whoever it was to come in. The door opened slowly, and a woman stepped inside. She was thin, with tired eyes and hands that looked like they had known hard work. Her coat was old but clean, and her shoes had been worn down at the heels. Behind her stood a boy. He looked about 10 years old, maybe 11, small for his age, with dark hair that needed a trim and clothes that didn't quite fit right. He kept his eyes on the floor, like he was afraid to look around. Helen studied them for a moment. She had seen this kind of thing before. People from the other side of town, wandering into the academy with big dreams and empty pockets. They always wanted something, a free lesson, a chance, a miracle. The woman cleared her throat nervously. She introduced herself and explained that she was there about her son. She said his name was Leo. She said he loved the piano more than anything in the world. She said he had been playing for a few years now, teaching himself on an old keyboard at the community center down on Miller Street. She asked if there was any way he could audition for a spot in one of the classes. Helen leaned back in her chair and looked at the boy again. Leo. He still hadn't looked up. His hands were stuffed in his pockets, and he seemed to be trying to make himself as small as possible. There was nothing about him that suggested anything special. No confidence, no spark. Just a quiet kid in second-hand clothes. Helen almost said no right away. She had 100 reasons ready. The classes were full. The waiting list was long. There were students who had been preparing for years, students with training, students who came from musical families. She didn't have time to waste on someone who had been playing around on a community center keyboard, but something made her pause. Maybe it was the look on the mother's face. The hope mixed with fear. The way she stood there, clutching her purse like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Helen recognized that look. It was the look of a woman who had used every bit of courage she had just to walk through that door. So instead of saying no, Helen said something else. She said fine. She said the boy could play something for her. Just one piece. And then she would decide. She made it sound like she was doing them a favor. Like she was being generous. The mother's face lit up. She thanked Helen over and over, squeezing her son's shoulder and whispering something in his ear. Leo finally looked up. His eyes met Helen's for just a second before darting away again. There was something in that glance, something Helen didn't notice at the time but would remember later. Helen gestured toward the piano in the corner of the room. It was a Steinway, worth more than most people's cars. She had seen students tremble just standing near it. She expected this boy to do the same, but Leo walked toward the piano like he was walking toward an old friend. His steps were slow, careful, almost reverent. He reached out and touched the side of the instrument, running his fingers along the smooth black surface. He didn't seem nervous anymore. He seemed calm, peaceful, even. Helen watched with her arms crossed. She had already made up her mind, really. She was just going through the motions. She would let the boy play his little piece, probably something simple he had picked up from a YouTube video, and then she would gently explain that he wasn't ready for this level of instruction. She would suggest he keep practicing, maybe try again in a few years. She would be polite about it, professional. She glanced at the clock again. Her real student would be arriving soon. A girl from a wealthy family across town. Someone whose parents had been bringing her to lessons since she was 4 years old. That was the kind of student Helen understood. That was the kind of student who made sense. Leo sat down on the piano bench. It was too high for him, so he adjusted it himself, lowering it with the little knobs on each side. He did it smoothly, like he had done it 1,000 times before. Then he positioned himself in front of the keys and placed his hands in his lap. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask what he should play. He just sat there for a moment, breathing slowly, his eyes half closed. Helen felt a flicker of impatience. She opened her mouth to tell him to go ahead, to hurry up, that she didn't have all day. But before she could speak, Leo lifted his hands to the keys, and everything changed. The first note hit the air like a whisper. Soft, gentle, almost shy. Helen barely noticed it. She was still standing there with her arms crossed, still thinking about her schedule, still preparing the polite rejection she would deliver in a few minutes. But then came the second note. And the third. And suddenly the whispers became words. And the words became sentences. And the sentences became something Helen had not expected at all. Leo was playing Chopin. Not a simple piece. Not something a beginner would attempt. He was playing the Ballade, no, 1-inch G minor, one of the most demanding compositions in the entire classical piano repertoire. It was a piece that took most students years to master. A piece that made grown adults cry from frustration. A piece that Helen herself had struggled with when she was studying at the conservatory decades ago. And this boy, this small, quiet boy from the community center on Miller Street, was playing it like he had been born with the music already inside him. Helen's arms slowly dropped to her sides. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She took a step backward without realizing it, her body moving on its own, trying to make sense of what her ears were telling her. The music filled the room. It climbed the walls and pressed against the windows. It wrapped around Helen like something warm and heavy. She could feel it in her chest, in her throat, in the back of her eyes, where tears were starting to form. Leo's hands moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for someone his age. His fingers were small, but they stretched and reached and found every note exactly where it needed to be. There was no hesitation, no stumbling, no second guessing. He played like the piano was part of his body, like the music was flowing through him instead of from him. Helen looked at his face. His eyes were closed now, and there was an expression there that she had only seen a handful of times in her entire career. It was the look of someone who was not performing, but living. Someone who was not playing music, but speaking it. Every phrase, every rise and fall, every moment of tension and release came from somewhere deep inside him. Somewhere real. She turned to look at Leo's mother. The woman was standing by the door, with both hands pressed over her mouth. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but she made no sound. She just watched her son, her eyes full of something that looked like pride and pain all mixed together. Helen turned back to the piano. She didn't know what to do with her hands, so she clasped them together in front of her. She didn't know what to do with her thoughts, so she just let them scatter. Everything she had believed 5 minutes ago now seemed foolish. Everything she had assumed about this boy now seemed cruel. The piece moved into its darker passages. The melody shifted, became heavier, more urgent. Leo leaned into the keys, his small body swaying slightly with the rhythm. His fingers danced and struck and caressed the ivory, drawing out sounds that seemed too big, too full, too alive to be coming from a child. Helen felt something crack open inside her chest. It was a strange sensation, almost physical. Like a door she had kept locked for years was suddenly being forced open. She didn't want to feel this way. She didn't want to be moved. She had built her walls carefully, brick by brick, over 2 decades of teaching. She had learned to keep her distance, to stay professional, to not let students get under her skin. But this boy was not just getting under her skin. He was reaching straight into her heart and pulling out things she had forgotten were there. She remembered why she had started playing piano in the first place. She remembered being young and full of wonder, sitting at her grandmother's old upright in the living room, discovering that she could make sounds that meant something. She remembered the first time a piece of music had made her cry. She remembered believing that music was magic, that it could heal, that it could connect people across time and space. Somewhere along the way, she had lost all of that. Teaching had become a job. Students had become names on a roster. Music had become technique and competition and reputation. She had stopped listening with her heart and started listening only with her trained ear. Always analyzing, always judging, always looking for flaws. But there were no flaws in what Leo was playing. There was only truth. Raw, unpolished, beautiful truth. The piece built toward its climax. The notes came faster, louder, more intense. Leo's hands flew across the keyboard, never missing, never faltering. The room seemed to vibrate with the sound. Helen realized she was holding her breath. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the music softened. The storm passed. The final passages rolled out like waves, retreating from a shore. Gentle and tired, and full of longing, Leo played the last notes with such tenderness that Helen felt her heart break a little. Not from sadness, but from something else. From recognition, maybe. From the memory of what it felt like to love something so completely. The final chord hung in the air for a long moment. Then silence. Leo lifted his hands from the keys and placed them back in his lap. He opened his eyes and stared at the piano. Not at Helen. Not at his mother. Just at the instrument. Like he was thanking it for something. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The silence was thick and heavy, filled with everything that had just happened. Helen realized her cheeks were wet. She reached up and touched her face, surprised to find tears there. She couldn't remember the last time music had made her cry. It had been years. Maybe decades. She looked at Leo again. Really looked at him this time. She saw the second-hand clothes, and the messy hair, and the small frame, but she also saw something else now. Something she had completely missed before. She saw a boy who carried music inside him like other people carried blood. She saw a gift so rare and so pure that it made everything else seem small. Her throat felt tight. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. What could she possibly say? How could she explain the way her entire worldview had just shifted in the space of 8 minutes? Leo's mother finally broke the silence. Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. She asked if her son had done okay. She asked if he had made too many mistakes. She said she was sorry if he wasn't good enough. That she knew he was still learning. That they could come back another time if this wasn't the right moment. Helen stared at her. The woman had no idea. She genuinely had no idea what her son had just done. She didn't understand that what Leo had just played was not simply okay. It was not just good enough. It was extraordinary. It was the kind of playing that came along once in a generation, maybe less. Helen opened her mouth to respond. But before she could speak, there was a knock at the door. Her next student had arrived. The girl from the wealthy family, the one with years of training and expensive private lessons. Helen looked at the door, then back at Leo, then at his mother. She felt like she was standing at a crossroads, like whatever she said next would change everything. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in 22 years, she made a choice that surprised even herself. Helen walked to the door and opened it. Standing in the hallway was a girl named Vivian, 12 years old, dressed in a perfectly pressed outfit that probably cost more than Leo's entire wardrobe. Behind her stood her mother, a woman with expensive jewelry and an impatient expression. Helen had been teaching Vivian for 3 years. The girl was talented in a technical sense. She practiced exactly as much as she was supposed to. She hit the right notes at the right times, but there was something missing in her playing, something hollow. Helen had never been able to put her finger on it until this very moment. Now she understood. Vivian played music. Leo lived it. Helen did something she had never done before in her entire career. She apologized to Vivian's mother and said that something urgent had come up. She asked if they could reschedule the lesson for later in the week. The mother looked shocked, then annoyed, then offended. She started to protest, saying they had driven all the way across town, saying they had a schedule to keep, but Helen just shook her head gently and said she was very sorry, that it couldn't be helped, that she would make it up to them. Then she closed the door. She turned back to face Leo and his mother. They were both staring at her with wide eyes, like they couldn't believe what had just happened. To be honest, Helen couldn't quite believe it either. She walked over to a chair near the window and sat down heavily. Her legs felt weak. Her mind was still spinning from what she had just witnessed. She needed a moment to collect herself, to figure out what to say. Leo's mother started apologizing. She said they didn't mean to cause any trouble. She said they could leave if this was a bad time. She kept glancing at her son like she was worried they had done something wrong. Helen held up her hand to stop her. She said there was no need to apologize. She said that what her son had just played was one of the most remarkable things she had ever heard in 22 years of teaching. She said she needed to know everything. Where had he learned to play like that? How long had he been practicing? Who had been teaching him? The mother looked confused at first, like she didn't understand the questions. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she began to explain. She said that Leo had always been different. Even as a baby, he would stop crying whenever music played. As a toddler, he would sit completely still and listen to songs on the radio with an intensity that seemed strange for such a young child. By the time he was 4, he was obsessed with the piano. He would point at them in store windows. He would stop walking whenever he heard one being played somewhere nearby. But they couldn't afford a piano. They couldn't afford lessons. His father had left when Leo was 3, and she had been working 2 jobs ever since, just to keep a roof over their heads. Music lessons were a luxury that existed in a different world, a world they didn't belong to. Then one day, when Leo was 6, they discovered the community center on Miller Street. Someone had donated an old electronic keyboard, one of those cheap ones with the little plastic keys. It was sitting in the corner of the activity room, mostly ignored by the other kids. But Leo walked straight to it like he had been waiting his whole life for that moment. He started teaching himself. At first it was just random sounds, experiments, figuring out how the keys worked. But within weeks he was picking out melodies he had heard on television. Within months he was playing simple songs from memory. The staff at the community center noticed and started letting him stay late so he could practice. They gave him headphones so he wouldn't disturb the other activities. The mother paused and wiped her eyes. She said that Leo spent every free moment at that keyboard. Before school, after school, weekends, holidays. While other kids were playing sports or video games, her son was sitting in that community center, teaching himself piano from YouTube videos and recordings he found online. He would watch videos of famous pianists performing and study their hands. He would slow the videos down and watch the same passage over and over until he understood how it worked. He would listen to recordings hundreds of times, memorizing every note, every pause, every tiny detail. Then he would go to the keyboard and try to recreate what he had heard. She said it wasn't easy. The keyboard at the community center only had 61 keys, not the full 88 of a real piano. Some of the keys were sticky. The sound quality was poor. But Leo never complained. He just worked with what he had. Helen listened to all of this with a growing sense of wonder and shame. Wonder at the dedication this child had shown. Shame at how quickly she had dismissed him based on his appearance and background. She asked the mother why they had come to the academy today. What had made them finally reach out? The mother said that one of the workers at the community center had heard Leo playing a few weeks ago. The woman had been so moved that she started crying. She told the mother that Leo had a gift, a real gift, and that it would be a crime to let it go to waste. She was the one who suggested they try the academy, who looked up the address, who encouraged them to take a chance. The mother said she had been terrified to come. She knew they didn't belong in a place like this. She knew they couldn't afford the lessons, couldn't afford the proper clothes, couldn't afford any of it. But she also knew that her son deserved a chance. He had worked so hard, sacrificed so much, given everything he had to this one dream. She couldn't let fear stop her from at least trying. Helen felt something shift inside her chest again. That cracking sensation from earlier was growing, spreading, breaking down walls she had spent years building. She looked at Leo. He was still sitting at the piano bench, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the keys. He hadn't said a single word this entire time. He just sat there, quiet and patient, like he was used to waiting for other people to decide his fate. Helen stood up and walked over to him. She knelt down so she was at his eye level, something she rarely did with any student. She asked him a question. She asked him why he loved the piano so much. For a long moment, Leo didn't answer. He just kept staring at the keys, his small fingers twitching slightly like they wanted to play again. Then, finally, he spoke. His voice was soft and serious, much older than his years. He said that when he played, he didn't feel small anymore. He didn't feel poor or different or invisible. When he played, he felt like he could say all the things he didn't have words for. He felt like he mattered. He felt like someone was finally listening. Helen had to look away. She pressed her hand to her mouth and took a shaky breath. In all her years of teaching, no student had ever given her an answer like that. Most of them talked about competitions, about impressing people, about getting into good schools. They talked about music like it was a tool, a means to an end. But Leo talked about music like it was oxygen, like it was the thing keeping him alive. Helen made her decision right then and there. She didn't care about the waiting list. She didn't care about what the other teachers would say. She didn't care about any of the rules she had followed so carefully for so many years. This boy was going to be her student, and she was going to make sure the whole world heard him play. But first, she had to figure out how to make it happen. Because as much as she wanted to help, the reality was complicated. The academy had policies. There were fees and requirements and bureaucratic hurdles that wouldn't just disappear because she had been moved by a performance. She was going to have to fight for this kid. And for the first time in a very long time, Helen Porter was ready to fight. The next morning, Helen arrived at the academy an hour before anyone else. She sat in her car in the parking lot, watching the sun rise over the building, thinking about what she was about to do. She had barely slept the night before. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Leo's music. Every time she started to drift off, she saw his small hands moving across the keys with that impossible grace. She had made a promise to herself. She had told Leo and his mother that she would find a way. Now, she had to keep that promise. The academy director was a man named Richard Cole. He was in his 60s, tall and thin, with gray hair combed neatly to one side and glasses that always seemed to be sliding down his nose. He had been running Westbrook for almost 15 years, and he took great pride in the institution's reputation. The academy was known for producing winners, competition champions, scholarship recipients, students who went on to attend the best music conservatories in the country. Richard was not a cruel man, but he was a practical one. He believed in standards. He believed in processes. He believed that the academy's success came from careful selection and rigorous training. He did not believe in charity cases or exceptions to the rules. Helen knew all of this. She had worked alongside Richard for over 2 decades. She understood how he thought, what he valued, what arguments might move him, and which ones would fall flat. She spent the drive to work rehearsing what she would say, trying out different approaches in her head. When Richard arrived at 9 o'clock, Helen was waiting outside his office. He looked surprised to see her there. She was not the type to show up unannounced. In 22 years, she had never once asked him for a favor. He invited her in and offered her coffee, which she declined. She was too nervous for coffee. Her hands were already shaking slightly, and she didn't want him to notice. She sat down across from his desk and told him everything. She told him about Leo and his mother walking into her studio the day before. She told him about her initial assumptions, her plan to reject them quickly and move on with her schedule. She told him about the moment Leo started playing, about the Chopin ballade, about the way the music had filled the room and changed something inside her. Richard listened without interrupting. His face remained neutral, unreadable. When Helen finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question Helen had been dreading. He asked how the family planned to pay for lessons. Helen admitted that they couldn't. She explained the situation honestly. The single mother working 2 jobs, the absent father, the years of teaching himself on a donated keyboard at a community center. She said that Leo's family had nothing, but that Leo himself had something far more valuable than money. He had a gift that could not be taught, could not be bought, could not be manufactured through expensive lessons and private tutors. Richard sighed. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He said he understood Helen's enthusiasm, but the academy had policies for a reason. They couldn't just give away free lessons to everyone with a sad story. If they made an exception for one student, others would expect the same. The whole system would fall apart. Helen felt her heart sink. She had expected this resistance, but hearing it out loud still hurt. She tried another approach. She mentioned the Academy's scholarship fund, the one they used to help promising students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Surely Leo would qualify for something like that. Richard shook his head. He said the scholarship fund was limited and already allocated for the year. There was a formal application process, a committee review, auditions that happened only twice a year. The next round wouldn't be until spring, 6 months away. Helen leaned forward in her chair. She asked Richard to make an exception. Just this once. She said she had never asked him for anything in 22 years. She said she had given this academy the best years of her life, had built its reputation with her own hands, had trained more champions than any other teacher on staff. She was asking him to trust her. She was asking him to believe that this boy was worth breaking the rules for. Richard was quiet again. Helen could see him thinking, weighing the options, calculating the risks. She held her breath. Finally, he spoke. He said he couldn't give her an answer right now. He needed time to think it over, to look at the budget, to consider the implications. He said he would let her know by the end of the week. Helen wanted to argue, wanted to push harder, but she knew Richard well enough to understand that pushing would only make things worse, so she thanked him for listening and left his office with a heavy feeling in her chest. The rest of the week passed slowly. Helen went through the motions of her regular lessons, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about Leo, wondering what he was doing, whether he was at the community center right now, practicing on that old keyboard with the sticky keys. She had given Leo's mother her phone number before they left that first day. She had told them she would be in touch as soon as she knew anything. Every night, she stared at her phone, wanting to call with good news, having nothing to say. On Thursday evening, her phone rang. It was Richard. His voice was flat, businesslike. He said he had reviewed the situation carefully. He said he had looked at the budget from every angle. He said he appreciated Helen's dedication and her passion. And then he said no. He said the academy simply couldn't afford to make this kind of exception. He said he was sorry, but his hands were tied. He wished the boy well and suggested they try some of the free music programs offered by the city. Helen hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time. She felt like something had been taken from her. Not just the opportunity to teach Leo, but something bigger, some hope she hadn't realized she was carrying. She thought about calling Leo's mother and delivering the bad news. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. Not yet. Not like this. Instead, she did something unexpected. She started making phone calls. Not to the academy, but to people she hadn't spoken to in years. Old colleagues, former students, people who had moved on to successful careers in music. People who owed their starts to the training she had given them. She called in every favor she had. She told Leo's story over and over, each time with more urgency, more passion. She asked for donations, for sponsorships, for anything anyone could give. Some people said no. Some people didn't call back. But others listened. Others remembered what Helen had done for them years ago. How she had believed in them when no one else did. How she had pushed them to become better than they thought they could be. By Saturday afternoon, Helen had raised enough money to cover a full year of private lessons, not through the Academy's official channels, but through her own network, her own reputation, her own decades of goodwill. She called Leo's mother that evening. When she explained what had happened, what she had done, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then she heard crying. Not sad crying, the other kind. The kind that comes when something you never dared to hope for suddenly becomes real. Helen told her to bring Leo to the academy on Monday morning. She said they had work to do. When she hung up the phone, Helen sat alone in her living room, looking at the old piano in the corner. It was the same piano she had learned on as a child. The one her grandmother had given her all those years ago. She hadn't played it in months, maybe longer. She walked over and sat down on the bench. She placed her fingers on the keys, feeling the familiar weight of them, the coolness of the ivory, and for the first time in years, she began to play. Not for a student, not for a competition, not for anyone but herself. The music filled her small apartment, and Helen remembered who she used to be. She remembered why she had fallen in love with this instrument in the first place. Leo had given her something without even knowing it. He had reminded her what music was supposed to feel like. Now it was her turn to give something back. Monday came faster than Helen expected. She woke up before her alarm, her stomach full of butterflies like she was the one about to start lessons instead of Leo. She put on her best blouse and arrived at the academy early, making sure the studio was perfect. She tuned the piano herself, something she hadn't done in years. She wanted everything to be right. Leo and his mother arrived at exactly 9 o'clock. The boy was wearing the same clothes from before, but his hair had been neatly combed, and there was something different in his eyes. A light that hadn't been there during that first nervous visit. Hope, maybe, or excitement, or both. His mother stood at the doorway, clutching her purse the same way she had the first time. But now there were no tears of worry, just a quiet smile that said more than words ever could. Helen knelt down to Leo's level and made him a promise. She told him that from this day forward, she would give him everything she had, every technique she knew, every piece of wisdom she had gathered over 30 years of playing and 22 years of teaching. She promised to push him hard, to challenge him, to never let him settle for less than his best. But she also promised to believe in him, even when he doubted himself. Especially then. Leo nodded seriously, like he understood the weight of what she was saying. Then he walked to the piano and sat down, ready to begin. And so their journey started. The first few months were intense. Helen had to undo some of the habits Leo had developed from teaching himself. His posture needed work. His fingering technique, while remarkably good for someone self-taught, had some gaps that needed filling. There were music theory basics he had never learned, fundamentals that most students picked up in their very first lessons. But Leo absorbed everything like a sponge. What took other students weeks to understand, he grasped in days. What took months for others to master, he conquered in weeks. His dedication was unlike anything Helen had ever witnessed. He practiced for hours every day, not because anyone told him to, but because he couldn't imagine doing anything else. Helen arranged for Leo to have access to the academy's practice rooms after hours. She gave him a key and told him he could come whenever he wanted. Some nights, when she drove past the building on her way home, she would see the light on in one of the second-floor windows. She would sit in her car for a few minutes, listening to the faint sound of music drifting out into the night, and she would smile. Word began to spread around the academy. Other teachers heard about the boy Helen had discovered, the one who played Chopin like he had lived it. Some were skeptical at first. They whispered that Helen was exaggerating, that she had let her emotions cloud her judgment. But one by one, they heard Leo play, and one by one, they stopped whispering. Richard Cole, the director who had initially said no, came to observe one of Leo's lessons about 4 months in. He stood in the corner of the studio with his arms crossed, his face giving nothing away. Leo played a Rachmaninoff prelude that afternoon, a piece so technically demanding that most students didn't attempt it until college. When Leo finished, Richard didn't say anything. He just nodded slowly, put his glasses back on, and walked out. But later that day, he stopped Helen in the hallway. He admitted that he had been wrong. He said the academy would be honored to offer Leo a full scholarship going forward. He said he was glad Helen had pushed back. Helen thanked him, but she didn't feel triumphant. She just felt grateful. Grateful that Leo was finally getting what he deserved. Grateful that she had trusted her instincts. Grateful that she had been given a second chance to remember why she loved teaching in the first place. The years passed, and Leo grew. Not just as a musician, but as a person. The quiet, withdrawn boy who had walked into Helen's studio that gray October afternoon slowly transformed into a confident young man. He still didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. His words carried the same weight as his music. Thoughtful, deliberate, true. At 14, Leo entered his first major competition. Helen drove him there herself, sitting in the audience with his mother, both of them holding hands like nervous parents at a school play. When Leo walked onto the stage, he looked so small against the massive concert grand piano. But the moment he started playing, he filled the entire hall. He won first place, and the judges called his performance one of the most mature they had ever heard from someone his age. More competitions followed. More victories. By 16, Leo was performing internationally. Critics wrote about him in glowing terms, calling him a prodigy, a once-in-a-generation talent, a young man destined for greatness. His name appeared in music magazines and newspapers. Invitations arrived from concert halls around the world. Through it all, Leo remained the same humble person he had always been. He never bragged. He never acted like he was better than anyone else. When interviewers asked about his success, he always mentioned two people first: his mother, who had sacrificed everything to support him, and Helen, who had given him a chance when no one else would. Helen kept teaching at the academy, but something had changed in her. The cynicism that had built up over the years had melted away. She started a new program for underprivileged children, seeking out young musicians from backgrounds like Leo's, kids who had talent but no opportunity, kids who might never be seen if someone didn't look for them. She called it the Open Door Initiative. Within 3 years, it had helped dozens of students receive scholarships and training they never could have afforded on their own. Some of them went on to win competitions. Some became music teachers themselves. All of them carried with them the message Helen wanted to spread. That talent doesn't care about your zip code. That potential doesn't check your bank account. That sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places. Leo came back to visit whenever he could. Even as his career took him to stages in Paris, Vienna, Tokyo, and New York, he always made time to return to the academy where it all began. He would walk into Helen's studio unannounced, sit down at the old Steinway, and play something just for her. Sometimes a piece they had worked on together years ago. Sometimes something new he was preparing for an upcoming concert. Sometimes just an improvisation. A musical conversation between two people who understood each other without needing words. One afternoon, during one of these visits, Leo asked Helen a question. He asked her if she ever regretted taking a chance on him. He said he knew it hadn't been easy. He knew she had risked her reputation, fought against the system, put herself on the line for a kid she had just met. Helen looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled and shook her head. She told him that taking a chance on him was the best decision she had ever made. Not because of the competitions he won, or the fame he achieved, but because he had reminded her of something she had forgotten. He had reminded her that music was not about technique or trophies or reputation. It was about connection. It was about truth. It was about those rare moments when sound becomes something more, something that touches the deepest part of who we are. Leo had given her that gift on a gray October afternoon when she least expected it, and she had spent every day since trying to pass it on to others. She told him that she didn't save him that day. He saved her. Leo didn't say anything. He just turned back to the piano and started to play. The music filled the room the same way it had all those years ago. Warm and alive and full of everything that matters. And Helen sat back in her chair, closed her eyes, and listened. Some people wait their whole lives for a moment that changes everything. Helen had found hers in the most unlikely place. In the hands of a boy she had almost turned away. She would never make that mistake again.